G'day. Been very busy with interviews lately on radio and television. I think I've done some 25 interviews this year, all on important topics. This is one that I finally learnt how to upload for you, and I've got the permission of the ABC to do so. I think you'll find it very helpful. So please stay tuned while I press some buttons.
You're listening to Ewan Gilbert on ABC Central West and Western Plains.
Well, this week's award for the seemingly most boring and dry announcement goes to IPART, the independent body which determines each year how much your local council is allowed to increase your rates. But while your eyes, like mine, may have initially glazed over when or if you heard about this at all, I think it really is worth taking a minute this morning to realise what's just happened. A bit of background. Up until now, IPART generally allows your local council to increase your rates a few percentage points each year, taking into account things like inflation and the cost of doing business, those sorts of things.
You're listening to Ewan Gilbert on ABC Central West and Western Plains.
Well, this week's award for the seemingly most boring and dry announcement goes to IPART, the independent body which determines each year how much your local council is allowed to increase your rates. But while your eyes, like mine, may have initially glazed over when or if you heard about this at all, I think it really is worth taking a minute this morning to realise what's just happened. A bit of background. Up until now, IPART generally allows your local council to increase your rates a few percentage points each year, taking into account things like inflation and the cost of doing business, those sorts of things. But for the first time ever, IPART this week has decided that the maximum amount your council will be able to increase your rates next year, they call it the rate peg, will depend on your area's level of population growth. The theory being that the more people that move to your town, the more revenue is required to build more facilities, to upgrade roads, maintain services like rubbish collection and the local pool. For areas with little to no growth, IPART says they can only increase rates by 0.7%, whereas for areas with lots of growth, they can charge up to 5% more. So, you might be wondering, what is their calculated population growth for right here in the Central West? Well, of the 12 local councils listening this morning, only 3 will be able to charge more than the bare minimum, and 2 of those by only just. So, should you care? Joseph Drew is a Professor of Local Government at the University of Technology in Sydney and joins us on the line. Hello, Joseph.
G'day, Ewan. How are you?
I'm very well. Look, it is hard to have sympathy for councils not being allowed to charge us too much in our rates.
Yeah, that's right. No one wants to pay extra rates, and I certainly don't. And I'm in a rural council myself, Tamworth, but it's only allowed to put them up 0.7%. But look, I know the other end of the story because I'm constantly helping out councils who are about to go broke. And the other end of the story is that if you don't get enough taxation revenue, services suddenly plummet, you get an administrator in, you lose democracy, and lots of people lose their jobs. So it's even more catastrophic if we don't pay enough tax than if we get away with paying less.
Okay, what do you make of this decision by IPART this week to peg rates to population growth?
Yeah, well, there's the 2 components still. So you've got the local government cost index, but that never measured anything properly, and everyone's criticised it for many, many years. And now you've got the population growth. It's the completely wrong unit to be looking at. Scholarly literature for decades has shown that if you wanted to look at just one unit, you would look at the number of growth, the growth in the number of assessments. You know, you think about it, a house with 2 adults and 5 kids compared to a house with 1 adult, it's not going to cost 5 times more to look after the house with 5 people living in it, because most of your costs in local government, your single biggest cost is roads. It's a quarter of your expenditure, and that doesn't change depending how many people are sitting in the house. So completely wrong unit. And it's completely the wrong time to be changing things so suddenly. We're about to enter into an inflation super cycle. Everyone understands that, apart from our Reserve Bank and our federal government, that in every other country they've got to produce price indexes, which is a measure of factory inflation, sitting at 9% or higher. This is not the time that you want to be constraining councils to increase their tax by 0.7% when they're looking at huge increases into their costs next year.
Okay, how big is that difference, do you think? And why might 0.7%, in the worst case scenario, not be enough?
Okay, so if now even the RBA is saying that inflation might be towards the top of their bend, so that's 3%. So if inflation is 3% and their taxes only go up 0.7%, in real terms, the value of money, councils will have 2.3% less money to spend next year. But they've still got the same number of staff. They've still got to maintain the same amount of roads. So what happens? They either dip into their savings if they have any unrestricted reserves, or they slowly go broke. Now, New South Wales should know all about this because we've got the first two financial failures of local government in the country in New South Wales. A lot of it's to do with this awful rate cap we've been dealing with for years. And I can only assume that for Christmas that people wanted to give the people of New South Wales another 2, 3, 4, 5 financial failures of local governments, because this is going to be disastrous, and I don't understand why people can't see that.
Okay, the Central New South Wales Joint Organisation, which is a kind of body that sort of takes in most of the councils here where we are, Joseph has put out a statement this morning that says we're going to see councils going to the wall because they can't afford to do their jobs. They'll have to make very hard choices, making up the shortfall by spending less on local roads, parks, pools, libraries and other community services. Is that just a scare campaign, do you think? Are they being a little over the top there?
No, it's not. I put up a video on my YouTube site just yesterday. I'm trying to get the attention of the decision makers at the top who just don't want to listen. There's at least half a dozen councils in New South Wales that could topple over any day. If I turned on my computer in the morning, turned on ABC News and saw 6 councils went broke last night, I'd go, yep, not a surprise. And they're the ones in the rural areas. And the problem is that most people in the decision-making roles don't live in rural areas. I'm quite unusual, an academic that lives out in the country, but most of the people in IPART and most of your ministers and everything else, they're all sitting in Sydney and they just don't understand. The councils that are most disadvantaged by this new system are the ones with low population growth. They're the ones out in the countryside. They're the ones who are already struggling and about to topple over. As your joint organisation is saying, it is an absolute disaster. Couldn't come at a worse time. We could be hitting inflation well above 3% next year, and some councils just won't cope. It's as simple as that. If you don't have the money, you can't pay the wages.
And, some people listening this morning might be saying, well, hang on a minute, I thought we were growing at a great rate of knots here in regional New South Wales. We keep hearing these stories about more and more people moving to regional New South Wales, places like Orange, for example. Well, the IPART's actually published its calculations for the population growth for the next year for places like Orange. 0.1% is what they're saying, Dubbo 0.6%, Lithgow, Narromine, Cowra, Parks, Bland Shire councils, nothing, no growth in population whatsoever, says IPART. John's on the text line this morning, Joseph in Young, and he says, I thought rates were based on land value. He's in part right, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Your particular rate you pay is based on your land value, but the total tax take that the local government's allowed to get is capped with this rate cap, and then they just divide it up, share it out according to people's land values. So it's all very confusing. One of the problems that you sort of hit on just a few seconds ago too with this population growth factors, people need to know that the ABS population growth data is an estimate. Unless it's a census year, we don't know for sure how many people in a local government area. And the ABS themselves a few years ago produced a report saying that from year to year, they're in error by 2.6% for very large local government areas, up to 15.6% for very small areas, such as where we are, and the errors are usually an undercount. So what happens is they start with the correct figure in the census year and they adjust it for changes in Medicare details and changes in electoral roll details. But lots of people that move into an area don't change things straight away. Hence, the data is always inaccurate. So not only are we looking at the wrong data, we're also looking at data that we know, that the ABS quite clearly that tells us is inaccurate in the first place.
Yeah. Joseph Drew is with us this morning, a professor of local government at UTS. Finally, there is a safety net here, though, isn't there, in that local councils, if they feel that they've been particularly hard done by, if their costs have increased as you're sort of saying, or they're claiming by, an inordinate amount and they're only being able to raise their rates a very small amount, they can apply for a special variation, can't they? And is that not a sort of a great check and balance? They have to prove their case as to how much they want to raise their rates?
Well, it would be if SRVs were done properly and if there wasn't the silly little time frame on that we have for SRVs. So to apply for a special rate variation, you had to put your hand up back in November before you knew what your rate cap was. So
Right.
only people with a crystal ball would have been able to do that. So the ones that are disadvantaged by this now need to wait till next November to put their hand up. The application goes in the following February, and the August after that is when they finally get to charge the extra tax. And it could well be too late. So I would encourage any of your listeners, if they know your members, such as Paul Till, who's in a good position to do something about this, to get them to watch my YouTube site called Professor Joseph Drew's World of Local Government. If you know anyone in a local government, get them to watch my YouTube site. I'm going to start putting up videos about how councils can cope with this disaster, because someone needs to do something, or it's going to be devastating for communities, particularly through the bush where we live.
Yeah, I guess it's just it's hard to convince people that they should be fighting to pay more tax.
It is, but look, I accept it. It's just a part of life. If your local government tax minuscule compared to your state government tax and your federal government tax. Every time you go to a shop, you pay 10% on things. Your local government tax for most people's wages are less than 2% of their wage. It's minuscule. And the point is, particularly we know in the bush, is if you don't have local government, you're really stuffed, because state government and federal government largely ignore us, which is why we rely so much on our local government, and we just can't have them falling over. Go and ask communities like Central Darlingshire that have been in financial administration for 8-9 years that haven't had a council, how wonderful life is without local government. You'll quickly be quite happy to pay more tax on your rates assessment to avoid that sort of disaster.
Joseph Drew, great to talk to you this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ewan.
Joseph Drew is a professor of local government at the University of Technology in Sydney. Off the back of this announcement this week by IPART, the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal in New South Wales, which each year crunches the maths and decides how much local councils can increase your rates for the following year. This week they've decided that for 2022-2023, local councils can only increase their rates peg their rate increases alongside population growth. So they've published it all on their website. It's worth having a look at. You can track down your local council, but I've kind of half done it for you this morning. So only Bathurst, in our listening area, only Bathurst, Cabonne and Upper Lachlan will be allowed to charge more than the bare minimum in terms of rate increases. So the bare minimum is 0.7%. Bathurst and Cabonne will be allowed to charge 0.9%. Upper Lachlan does look like it's got the most significant sort of